My original plan for this week was to go see Ash, just because I feel like that's getting a lot of good buzz and people seem to really be enjoying it, and it seems like a fun sci-fi body horror film. Unfortunately, it was only playing at one theater near me, and the only showtime that they had was like after 10 o'clock, and your girl's gotta get up to go to work in the morning. So I was at the theater and I was like, well, I guess it's The Woman in the Yard. Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And yes, today we are talking about the latest Blumhouse release, The Woman in the Yard. I will say right off the bat, as far as like Q1 PG-13 Blumhouse horror films go, this actually isn't the worst of them. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a good movie. I'm just saying that while I was watching it, I didn't experience the same level of psychological despair that I did at something like a Nightswim or an Imaginary. It's hard to talk about this movie without getting into spoiler territory and talking about like details of the plot. So I'm not gonna give like too much away, but just be aware of that if you're someone that's like, I like to go into movies not knowing anything about the plot and the characters. I will say up front here, like, I don't think you need to run out to a theater and see this one. You could probably wait for it to come on streaming. I'm sure it will be available on Peacock within the next couple of weeks. And this is such a weird movie to talk about because it's hard to talk about the plot, which is a widowed mother of two dealing with grief, dealing with survivor's guilt at being in a horrible accident with her husband and she was the only one that came out alive. She's banged up, she has to use crutches to walk around on. She's trying to take care of her two children, and then one day this mysterious woman, this mysterious spiritual entity, just shows up on the front yard, chilling, sitting in a chair, and they have no idea who she is or where she comes from. Everything about the plot on face value just seems very goofy, and I know that this film has been kind of getting poked fun at online, especially around the fact that you have a ghost that is seemingly bringing their own chair to a haunting. And yes, the premise is a little bit of a head scratcher. I will say, I think when you actually sit down to watch it, it does somehow work better than what you would think. I think a lot of that just has to do with the actors. It's so weird. Like, it's not the complete train wreck that I was expecting it to be going into this movie. Like, I went in with super low expectations. At the same time, it is still very much like typical Blumhouse PG-13 horror. And I'm not calling out PG-13 because I think that like PG-13 horror is lesser than like R-rated or unrated horror. I actually don't. I think there's a lot of great PG-13 horror out there. It's just that with companies like Blumhouse, you're not going into it expecting a cinematic masterpiece. I talked about Drop last week, which is also a Blumhouse film. That's a PG-13 film, and that's one that I had a lot of fun with. Like, you can make really great films within the constraints of getting a certain rating. For the majority of the time, I don't think Blumhouse does a good job with that. They're just very much the company of like, okay, let's make something quick and easy and get it out there and we'll sell it to high schoolers and preteens, and that's how we'll get the majority of our budget back, right? That's been their business model for quite a number of years now. I do think the reason why this film works a little bit better is because it does have a slightly more cinematic feel to it than these films usually do. Usually a film like a Nightswim or an Imaginary feel a little bit on the cheaper side, just in terms of the fact that there's not really a specific style or specific vision to them. Whereas with The Woman in the Yard, there was some very cool like camera angle stuff going on, a lot of interesting camera movements, definitely giving you the feeling that you're in this weird fever dream of a movie, and some really beautiful shots as well. You get these like wide angles of this farmland where the majority of the film is taking place, and you can just feel both the isolation as well as the claustrophobia at the same time. It was kind of giving me vibes of like, I'm gonna say this and it's gonna be sacrilegious and I'm sorry, but it was kind of giving me like Twilight Zone vibes, not in like quality by any means, but just in the fact of having a very contained setting with characters that are waking up and just going about their everyday lives, and then something strange comes out of nowhere, and then the day just keeps getting more and more bizarre as it goes on. That is how the film flows, right? I would say like the first 20-25 minutes, you're with the family, getting to know them, getting to understand their dynamics, and then things start taking really weird turns by the second and third act. And again, some of it is really well done and some of it feels very eerie. I know this film is done by the same director that did Orphan and that House of Wax remake from the mid-2000s. Both films which I remember enjoying when I watched them as a teenager when they came out. Yes, I do remember being a teenager and kind of enjoying the House of Wax remake. Is that a film that people like? I don't know. Overall, how does the horror fandom feel about that? Is it a film that's gotten like a critical reprisal over the years? Let me know in the comments. So you do have a director coming in here that has definitely had more experience with filmmaking, and I feel like you can definitely tell that in terms of how the story is visually told. And I do think it does have a good job of taking on this very nightmarish quality, and I think that is enhanced by the actors in the film. You have Danielle Deadwyler, I'm sure I'm pronouncing her name wrong, so apologies, but I thought she was great as the mom in this film and really portraying someone that is struggling, and at the surface it seems like this is going to be yet another horror film that is focused on grief, and in a way it is, but you also learn that there's other deeper things happening with her character. But I think she does a really great job of just emoting the pain and the confusion and the frustration that she's having at this situation. I'm sure having to act with crutches the entire film was not an easy task. I do think that adds to you empathizing with her as a character. Also, props to this movie for getting child actors that are actually tolerable and just not super annoying. The daughter in particular was very sweet, and you just felt bad for her the entire time of having to watch her family getting torn apart. And then props to Peyton Jackson, who plays the son. I thought he did a really good job too, especially playing the young teenage son that has just lost his father and is now suddenly having to become the man of the house. I feel like normally when we have these kinds of Blumhouse movies and they're always centered around families, and usually like I just don't buy the family dynamics because the chemistry is just not there between the actors, whereas I feel like it was there with this film, and that definitely helped make for an easier viewing experience than normal. So kudos to all of the actors here. The actual monster herself, the woman in the yard, she had kind of cool moments throughout the film. She does not just like sit out in the yard the whole time. She does get up and do things. There are some cool effects with her character where she has this ability to cast her shadow on the walls, like inside the walls of the house, and then she can manipulate objects within the house through her shadow. So you get a lot of cool sequences in which you see her shadow on the walls and on the ceilings, and she's just like knocking things over and like grabbing the kids and dragging them across the room. And I thought that was fun. That had a very like whimsical fairy tale like feel to it. So some cool moments here and there, but overall I don't feel like the monster was really that like developed enough to become like a cool horror icon down the line. It's not like something like The Babadook, which is a film that I feel like I'm always bringing up in reviews nowadays, but I think that's just because we keep having these types of horror films that want to focus on motherhood and grief and grieving. You know, and I'll say too, and this is probably getting more into like slight spoiler territory here, the monster here is also one of those things where like, yes, you understand what it is and what it's made to represent and personify. Like many of these films, this is a monster that is representing the protagonist's psychology, very much manifestation of all of the negative feelings that they are having. We're seeing a lot of this in horror as well lately, but how that manifestation actually comes about, the film never explains. The ending is a little ambiguous. Like it's one of those films where it's like, interpret it how you see it. How the woman in the yard even got there in the first place, your guess is as good as mine.
Hey y'all, editing cat here. Sorry if the audio isn't that great. One other thing that I was thinking about while editing and going through just like the trailer to get clips. You see this in the trailer and they talk about this in the movie where the entity comes in and they're like, oh, today's the day. Today's the day. And my question is like, why? Like, what is it about this specific day that is making the entity show up? That's never explained. And they kind of do that thing that we're seeing in horror movies a lot, where the evil entity is going to the protagonist and being like, oh, you summoned me. But my question is still like, why? Like, what is it about this day specifically? Because it feels like this protagonist has been struggling for a while now. I just feel like having more clarity on that would have, I don't know, given more depth to the character, or better understanding of like where this entity is coming from.
Okay, let's talk about the themes of the film. So yes, once again, we have a horror film dealing with grief. Taking a step back and looking at things objectively, I understand why culturally we are seeing a lot of these kinds of films, and we've been getting a lot of these films for the past like 10 years. Again, I feel like ever since the Jennifer Kents and the Robert Eggers and the Ari Asters that have come out and made these horror films around grief and anxiety and dread and suffering, which for me personally, like, I don't want to discredit the feeling of grief. Grief is obviously one of the more icky parts of the human experience. It is something that never truly goes away. It is something that can creep up on you without warning, no matter how much time has passed. So I understand its power as a storytelling tool, but man, I'm just kind of getting burnt out on watching films where everyone is depressed and you have characters that are facing death and their only thought is like, yeah, cool, I'm okay dying, I want to die, my life is so miserable,
kill me now.
I don't know, I just kind of miss the days of like hanging out with characters who had at least some like joy in their life. And then the horror and tragedy is coming from watching these very joyful humans getting killed and slaughtered by some sort of monster. I don't know, maybe that's just like the slasher girly in me talking, but like the reason why I love a lot of slasher films is because you have a group of characters, usually friends, who are just like hanging out and partying, and we get to see the joys of life being contrasted with death. And I guess for me, like, that's what I find more terrifying. Again, this might just be a response to how people are feeling collectively. It makes me sad to think about, and I guess maybe this is why I'm like leaning more towards films like Hard Eyes or The Monkey, which I know are not like everyone's favorites so far this year, but at least with those films I was like, okay, at least I can laugh and have a good time. And while the film is touching on these themes, I don't think it really like pushed it that far in an interesting way. It kind of just relied on the same stuff that we've seen again and again, like grieving mom, lost her husband, having trouble raising the kids on her own. There were aspects of the protagonist that I did find really interesting. Again, this is getting into slight spoilers here. You learn that she's someone that has always kind of suffered with never feeling like her life is good enough. You learn that her being on this farmland, like, this was something that she seemed to like push her husband into because she thought it was going to make her happier than living in the city. And then she moved to the farm, and then she missed the city, and then that wasn't good enough. And she's always stuck in this mentality of like, my life sucks, I'm not fulfilled, I'm not going anywhere, blah, 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 blah. And so the monster, the woman in the yard, actually being a manifestation of that like sticky thought feeling of like, I'm never good enough, my life is never good enough. Like, I thought that was a more interesting metaphor for the monster rather than being about grief. I saw a similar theme in a movie that I reviewed a couple weeks ago called Little Bites. The Woman in the Yard is a 1,000 times better film than Little Bites is, but that was also a film that had to deal with themes around like self-sabotage. I think the thing that is lacking in both of these films is that it doesn't actually give us good enough character arcs where we can see the protagonist overcoming this inner turmoil that they are putting themselves in, right? There's not really a good moment of reflection on the protagonist's part to be like, oh, I'm doing this to myself. Instead, what we get with this film, and I'm going to be talking about the ending, so if you don't want spoilers, skip ahead a couple of minutes. I'll leave a timestamp somewhere. But with this film, what you have is this ending where the protagonist comes to the conclusion that the only way to fix the situation is to take her own life. And again, it doesn't really like show it, but it is heavily implied that she's going to take her own life at the end, and that her choosing death herself is not only the answer to her problem, but is also going to make her kids life better. And that just seems like a really bad message overall to be putting in your movie. I don't know why we're having an ending that feels like it is actively supporting the taking of one's own life. I really disliked the ending to this thing. It is very ambiguous. It does go off in kind of this like weird, parallel universe, otherworldly territory. And so I guess there is kind of questions here around like, well, did she actually do it, or did she somehow defeat the monster? My problem is that like if she was defeating the monster at the end and she was getting over her own negative thought pattern that she's in, like we needed to see that as an audience. Like we needed to see her standing very firmly in the realization of what she's doing to herself and firmly making the decision to change and to move on. Okay, spoiler talk for the ending is over. So yeah, overall, like I did not like the ending. I would say that I enjoyed like the first and second act of the film, because I feel like that is kind of the slow burn building of dread, and then the second act very much getting more experimental with, again, the camera angles and the kind of hallucinations of characters or different realities that characters are in. And then I feel like the third act just kind of took a really weird path, and we see this a lot with these kinds of Blumhouse films where you get a lot of like flashbacks or characters in a scenario where they're waking up and they have their family around them and they're like, oh, the monster is finally defeated, and then you realize like that's just a dream that they had. I feel like the third act of this film relies a lot on that, brings you into a flashback and you kind of see the exact same scene that you saw at the beginning of the film repeating again. It's not giving you any new information. So it's like clunky storytelling like that I just feel like was added for extra padding. The movie's only an hour and a half, but they still needed to put in all this extra stuff to get to that like 90-minute mark. There is a reliance on, I don't want to say jump scares because they're not really supposed to be jump scares. It's just these moments where like the character's opening a drawer and for some reason it is so obscenely loud that it just makes you jump by default. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that tactic is, but I really hate it and I wish that studios would stop doing it. So yeah, for the cinematography and the acting alone, this is much better than what I was expecting going into it, but overall still a very forgettable film. As I said at the beginning, like if you're interested in it, just wait for it to come on streaming. Aside from The Woman in the Yard, I also saw Opus recently, which I wish I had time to make a full video about because that was such a bizarre film, and I know that like it's getting terrible reviews and I know that the majority of audiences are just not liking it. And I'm not saying it's a good movie, just a very bizarre one. And I would say it's worth seeing just to see John Malkovich in a really crazy performance. He plays like this aging pop star and there's like this whole sequence in the middle of the film where he's just dancing and singing, and it is quite a sight to behold. So I might have to come back around at some point and revisit Opus and give it a proper video. I mentioned in another video a couple weeks ago that my spring is just gonna get a little bit hectic, and that's gonna start next week. I have to work at a film festival for 2 weeks, and then I have family coming in the week after that. I probably will not be able to see much. I'll probably be popping in on the community post just to say hi and to ask you all to tell me what you're watching. I want to say probably my next video will not be until Sinners in mid-April. And Sinners is a film that I am so excited about. Every time I see like trailers or TV spots for it, I get so hyped. Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan are always a great team together, and I'm just really excited to see their take on the vampire film. But until then, thank you so much for watching. If you did see Woman in the Yard, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I will see you again very soon. Thank you so much for watching.